So what if we tax pollution out of existence, right? If we discourage all of the pollution, then what do? How do we fight how do we fund the rest of, the fight against climate change? Because, we're way, over our heads when it comes to running this battle. And I'll give you a very simple example that most Americans will understand, because it's pretty straightforward and it's well taught in history. It's just a little bit of twist that confuses people typically. World War II came right after the Great Depression, the most miserable economic time in US history. No question about it. There's books and movies and stories about it. Everybody knows the Great Depression. But then everybody knows also the history of World War II and the massive amount of production and military might that was put into place in a matter of months, right after the Great Depression. So during the Great Depression, we were told that everybody was broke. There was no money. There was no money to be taxed to fund anything, right? It was miserable. And then all of a sudden, all of this massive military might was built. We moved from 25% unemployment to zero unemployment. We had to go beyond zero unemployment. We had to bring women into the labor force, retire people into the labor force just to keep up with the production for the war effort. And that's a massive boom in economic activity. How did we pay for it? Was there ever a debate in US Congress about who are we going to tax in order to fund the war? Or where is the money going to come from? Money was created into existence because there is a consensus. This is something that has to be done. We have the technology, we have the manpower, we have the resources, and we need to do it because it's the right thing to do. There was no question about money. People worked, were paid on time, so there was money created by the federal government. Things got done, right? We marshaled all the resources to get the public purpose that we wanted to achieve. Nobody was taxed to fund the war. But then people say, oh, the government borrowed money. Well, again, there was no money to be borrowed, right? We were in the midst of the Great Depression. The borrowing that most people talk about, the freedom bonds that the Treasury sold, they called them freedom bonds because they wanted to capitalize on the patriotic mood of the nation. Freedom bonds were not sold before the war. They were sold during the war. So money was already spent into existence. People had a lot of cash in their pockets. And like any normal person during that time, what would you do with your money? You want to buy a new car, you want to buy a new house, you want to spend it. But the entire city of Detroit, industrial system in Detroit, was shifted away from producing cars to producing military equipment. There were no new car models during the first 3 years of the war because everything was dedicated to the war. So even if you wanted to buy a new house or a new car, you wouldn't find it because everybody was working mostly for. So this would have caused inflation. If everybody went out and started bidding up house prices and car prices, we would have a serious issue of inflation. So freedom bonds were sold at the time to convince the population that had a lot of cash to spend to postpone their consumption until after the war. And that's exactly what happened after the war. So the bonds that were sold was not to fund the war. The war was already in place. The funding was already there. So selling government bonds is not the same, federal government bonds is not the same thing as the state of Ohio or the state of California selling bonds. Because why would the federal government need to borrow its own money? That's kind of a silly thing. It doesn't. But the federal government needed people to postpone their spending for a while until after the war to prevent inflation and to stabilize interest rates and to stabilize financial markets. There's a whole set of reasons why federal governments sell bonds, and it's definitely not to fund anything.
Well,
this is the best example I can think of, and this is really when people tell me you can't fight this climate change on a massive scale, we have to do it kind of bit by bit, and maybe by 2050, if we're not dead, we'll put a dent in this thing. That's why I go back to this example. We can, marshal the resources at a scale that the U.S. did during World War II, but dedicate this not to invading countries or destroying things, but to fixing the climate.
Well, let me ask you this before we go. What then, to the people watching this, how do people get involved, or how do people participate in this who aren't economists or scientists or whatever? How do they get involved and try to move the needle on this?
Well, for the average person who's not involved in politics, is not involved in academia, the best group that I can think of is Real Progressives, which is a grassroots organization You can find them on Facebook, on Twitter. It's sort of turning into a media company, a small media company. Lots of interviews with MMT activists and MMT economists, and legal scholars and others, environmentalists, and people running for office with an MMT informed public policy platform. Mm-hmm. You'll hear all those voices on Real Progressives. You'll get plugged into tons of resources. In terms of public policy think tanks, there's the Global Institute. Check us out on social media, on the website. There's the Levy Economics Institute at Bard College. Also, lots of my colleagues there do fantastic work. And the truth is that we're outnumbered.